Have you ever felt the exact moment your heart didn't just break, but turned to ash? It's not like the movies. There's no dramatic violin swell. There's just the sudden, piercing sound of a fork hitting a porcelain plate, and the realization that the person sitting across from you doesn't see a human being anymore. They see an obstacle. It was our 10th anniversary. 10 years of building a life, scraping pennies in a cramped studio apartment, and finally feeling like we had made it. I had spent 6 months on a waiting list to get a table at the Obsidian. It's the kind of place in the city where you don't just pay for the food, you pay for the status. I wanted to celebrate us. I wanted to celebrate the fact that we survived the lean years when we shared a single bowl of ramen just to keep the lights on. But when I arrived, 20 minutes early, clutching my vintage clutch and wearing the dress I'd saved 3 paychecks for, I saw him. My husband, Mark. He wasn't alone. He was already sitting at our table. The one I booked under my name, months in advance. With a woman who looked like she'd been carved out of ice and high-end Botox. I walked over, my legs feeling like lead. I thought it was a mistake. I thought maybe she was a client he had to meet last minute. I thought a lot of things because the truth was too heavy to carry. I leaned down, my voice trembling just a little, and said, "Mark, you're early. And I think there's been a mix-up with the seating." Mark didn't look up at first. He took a slow sip of a vintage red that probably cost more than my first car. Then, he looked at me. Not with guilt. Not with fear. He looked at me with a cold, clinical kind of annoyance. Like I was a fly in his soup. "There's no mix-up, Sarah," he said. His voice was steady. Too steady. I took the reservation. I needed it for someone who actually fits the room. I felt the air leave my lungs. I looked at the woman. She didn't even acknowledge me. She was busy adjusting her diamond watch, her eyes fixed on the menu as if I were invisible. I looked back at my husband. The man I'd supported through law school. The man whose dinner I'd cooked every night, while he pulled 80-hour weeks to make partner. "But Mark," I whispered, my voice cracking, "it's our anniversary. I made this reservation. We were supposed to." He stood up, just enough to lean in so only I could hear him. The smell of his expensive cologne, the one I bought him for his promotion, filled my senses. It felt like a physical assault. "Go home, Sarah. You're making a scene. You look tired. You don't belong here tonight. I'll have my assistant send a car for your things tomorrow." He sat back down and signaled the waiter. Not to help me, but to signal that I was an intruder, a nuisance to be cleared away. As the hostess approached with that look of pity that burns worse than fire, I realized something. The man I loved hadn't just left me, he had erased me. But as I turned to walk out of that gold-leafed dining room, past the staring eyes of the city's elite, I didn't cry. The tears were there, locked behind a wall of pure, freezing adrenaline. He thought he took my table. He thought he took my night. He had no idea he just gave me the rest of my life. But first, I had to find out who the woman in my seat actually was. The walk home was 3 miles. I didn't call an Uber. I didn't want a stranger in the front seat asking me how my night was or catching my eyes in the rearview mirror. I wanted to feel the cold New York air hitting my skin. I wanted the blisters forming on my heels to remind me that I was still alive. Every step was a rhythmic beat of realization. How long had I been a ghost in my own home? When did I stop being his partner and start being his starter wife? Mark was a senior partner at a top-tier firm now. He moved in circles of old money and new ruthlessness. I was the girl from the suburbs who worked in a library and believed in things like loyalty and, for better or worse. To Mark, those weren't virtues. They were liabilities. They were things you outgrow, like a cheap suit you wore to your first interview. When I got back to the apartment I had decorated, the one where I'd spent weekends painting the baseboards while he was the office. It felt like a tomb. I didn't turn on the lights. I walked into the walk-in closet. His side was organized, expensive and smug. My side was filled with clothes I'd worn for 5 years because we were saving for the future. What future? His future. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my hands. They were shaking. I realized that Mark hadn't just cheated. That would have been simple. That would have been a lapse in judgment. No, what I saw tonight was an execution. He had used my reservation because he knew it was the best table in the city and he wanted to impress his new acquisition, while simultaneously disposing of his past. He wanted to humiliate me in the one place I felt successful. The woman. I couldn't get her face out of my head. She wasn't just some girl from a club. She had a look of established power. I stood up and went to Mark's mahogany desk. It was usually off limits. Client confidentiality, he'd say with a dismissive wave. I tried the drawer. Locked. I knew the code. It was his mother's birthday, the only person he ever truly feared. The drawer clicked open. Inside wasn't just a stash of cash, it was a folder. A thick, blue folder labeled Project Alpha. I opened it, and my heart stopped. It wasn't about a new firm merger. It was about me. It was a step-by-step plan to divest me from our shared assets. It had dates. It had names of offshore accounts I'd never heard of. It had a timeline for when he would release me. The date for the final break. Tomorrow morning. The restaurant wasn't just a dinner. It was a victory lap. He thought he'd already won. He thought I was already buried. I stared at the documents, and for the first time in 10 years, I didn't see my husband. I saw a target. I looked at the very last page of the folder. There was a photo clipped to a bio. It was her. The woman from the restaurant. Her name was Elena Vance. Wait, Vance. She wasn't just his mistress. She was using his last name. I felt a cold chill wash over me that had nothing to do with the night air. I checked the marriage certificate pinned behind the bio. It was dated 3 weeks ago. In Vegas. Mark hadn't just replaced me. He had already married her. I wasn't even his wife anymore. I was a squatter in a life he had already handed over to someone else. I sat back in his leather chair, the leather creaking in the silence. He thought he had planned for everything. He thought he had covered every exit. But as I looked at the Project Alpha timeline, I noticed one thing he had overlooked. He had scheduled the final transfer of our joint investment account for 9:00 a.m. tomorrow. I looked at the clock. It was 1:15 a.m. I had less than 8 hours to decide if I was going to pack my bags and disappear like a good little ghost, or if I was going to make sure Mark Vance remembered this anniversary for the rest of his life. I stared at that marriage certificate until the ink seemed to bleed into the paper. 3 weeks ago, while I was at home, planning our 10th anniversary, he was standing in a neon-lit chapel in Nevada, swearing his life away to someone else. The betrayal wasn't just a knife in the back, it was a total demolition of my reality. Every "I love you" from the last month, every "I'll be home late, honey," was a calculated move to keep me quiet while he finalized his new life. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to grip the edge of the mahogany desk. This wasn't just an affair. This was a legal erasure. He had likely forged my signature on divorce papers months ago. Being a high-stakes lawyer, he knew exactly which corrupt notaries to call and which clerks to bribe. To the state of New York, Sarah Vance didn't exist anymore. I was a legal non-entity living in a dead woman's apartment. I looked back at the Project Alpha folder. Mark had even calculated the cost of my disposal. There was a line item for a one-way ticket to my mother's house in Ohio and a meager severance payment of $5,000. $5,000 for 10 years of my life. For putting him through school. For managing his image. For being the person who talked him down from every panic attack before a big trial. He really thought I was that cheap. I started digging through his digital files on the desktop. I'm a librarian. I know that people leave trails even when they think they're being quiet. I found a hidden partition on his hard drive. It wasn't filled with photos of Elena. It was filled with spreadsheets. Mark wasn't just moving our savings. He was skimming from his firm's escrow accounts. He was taking client money. Settlement money meant for families who had lost everything. And funneling it into the offshore accounts listed in Project Alpha. He wasn't just a cheater, he was a thief. He was using Elena, who I found out was a financial consultant, to wash the money before they disappeared to a country without an extradition treaty. That was the plan. Use the anniversary as the final straw. To kick me out, announce his retirement from the firm a week later, and vanish with the woman who actually fitted the room. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. The injustice of it was so pure it was almost beautiful. He wanted to leave me with nothing, not even my name, while he lived like a king on blood money. He sat in the obsidian tonight, sipping wine and laughing, knowing that by sunrise, I'd be homeless and he'd be a multimillionaire on his way to a private jet. I looked at the clock, 20:30 a.m. The silence of the apartment was heavy, but my mind was moving at 100 miles an hour. If I called the police now, he'd use his connections to bury me before the sun came up. If I called his partners, he'd claim I was a disgruntled ex-wife, making up lies. No, I couldn't go to the authorities. Not yet. I needed to hit him where it actually hurt. Mark Vance didn't care about people, and he didn't care about the law. He cared about two things: his ego and his ledger. I pulled out my phone and took high-resolution photos of every single page in that blue folder. I photographed the marriage certificate. I photographed the transfer logs of the stolen client funds. My hands weren't shaking anymore, they were steady. Then, I saw a small, handwritten note tucked into the back of the folder. It was Elena's handwriting. The Japanese merger is the final piece. Once Ishikawa signs, we're clear. Don't let the librarian ruin the optics. The optics. That was it. Mark was using me to maintain his stable family man image just long enough to secure a massive merger with Ishikawa Holdings. The Japanese investors were famously traditional. If there was even a whisper of scandal, especially a secret second marriage and embezzlement, the deal would evaporate, and Mark would be left holding a very empty, very illegal bag. He wanted me to go home and rot. Fine, I'd go home. But I wasn't going to rot. I was going to become the one thing a lawyer fears more than a judge. I was going to become the evidence. By 4:00 a.m., the adrenaline began to wear off, replaced by a crushing, soul-deep isolation. I stood in the middle of his living room, surrounded by expensive furniture that suddenly felt like props on a movie set. Every piece of art we'd picked out, every book on the shelf, felt tainted. I was standing in the center of a life that had been a lie for years, and for the first time in my life, I had absolutely no one to call. Who could I tell? My mother in Ohio. She'd just cry and tell me to come home and let God handle it. My friends, they were mostly lawyer wives, who traded in gossip like it was currency. If I told them, it would be back to Mark in 20 minutes, and he'd have a restraining order filed against me before breakfast. I was completely alone in a city of 8 million people, standing in a high-rise tomb. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the skyline. The city looked cold, indifferent. I felt a terrifying pull to just let go. To walk out the door with nothing, take that $5,000 severance, and disappear into the Midwest like he wanted. It would be so easy to stop fighting. My heart was heavy, and my spirit felt like it had been shredded. Part of me was still that little girl who believed in the sanctity of marriage, who believed that if you were good and loyal, you'd be protected. The conflict was tearing me apart. One voice in my head whispered that I was being vindictive, that I should just leave with my dignity intact. It told me that fighting a man like Mark was suicide. He had the money, the power, and the legal genius to crush me. What was I? A librarian with a few photos on a smartphone. I felt small. I felt like the nothing he had called me at the restaurant. Then I looked back at the desk. I saw the photo of Elena Vance. She was wearing a necklace that I recognized. It was a vintage piece Mark told me he'd lost in a move 3 years ago. It was my grandmother's. That was the spark. The sadness didn't vanish, but it crystallized. It turned from a soft, drowning pool into a sharp, jagged edge. He hadn't just stolen my future, he was stripping my past. He was giving my family's history to a woman who helped him rob orphans and widows. I realized that dignity wasn't walking away quietly so he could enjoy his stolen life. Dignity was making sure the truth saw the light of day. But the fear was still there, a cold lump in my throat. If I stayed and fought, I was entering a war with a man who didn't play by the rules. I was risking everything. My safety, my reputation, my sanity. I looked at the Project Alpha folder one last time. He had a section for potential contingencies. Under my name, he had written, "Sarah is passive. She will retreat to Ohio within 48 hours. No legal threat anticipated." He didn't even consider me a threat. He didn't even think I was capable of standing up. To him, I was just a predictable variable in an equation he had already solved. I checked the joint account one last time on my laptop. The balance was sitting there, 1.2 million. This was the nest egg we had built together, the one he was planning to drain at 900 a.m. My finger hovered over the transfer button. If I took it now, I could run. I could disappear. But then I'd be a thief, just like him. He'd have the law on his side, and he'd hunt me down. No, I wasn't going to take his money, I was going to take his air. I closed the laptop. The sun was starting to peek over the Atlantic, a thin, bruised line of purple and gray. The passive Sarah, the one who retreated to Ohio, died in that sunrise. I went to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and looked at the stranger in the mirror. I didn't recognize her, and that was exactly what I needed. The sun was fully up now, casting long, sharp shadows across the apartment. At 8:30 a.m., I heard the heavy thud of a courier envelope being slid under the door. I didn't need to open it to know what it was. Mark's assistant, a kid named Tyler who always looked too terrified to make eye contact, had delivered my eviction notice. I picked it up. The paper was heavy, expensive vellum. It was a formal notice to vacate and a pre-signed voluntary separation agreement. Mark wasn't even going to face me. He was trying to handle me like a breach of contract. I looked at the check stapled to the back. $5,000, signed with Mark's arrogant, sweeping signature. I walked to the kitchen, took a lighter from the drawer, and watched the corner of that check catch fire. I let it burn until it nearly touched my fingertips. Then dropped the blackened remains into the sink. I didn't need his blood money. I had something better. The silence in the room changed. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of a victim anymore. It was the quiet of a hunter waiting for the wind to shift. Mark thought he knew my next move. He thought I'd be at Penn Station by noon, crying into a paper cup of coffee. He was so certain of my weakness that he hadn't even changed his passwords on our shared cloud storage, or his personal iPad, which he'd left sitting on the nightstand in his rush to return to Alana. I picked up the iPad. My heart was thumping against my ribs, but my hands were dead steady. I didn't go for the bank accounts. I went for his calendar. Next Tuesday, 7:00 p.m., the Grand Ballroom at the Waldorf Astoria. The event was the Ishikawa Vance Gala. It was the official signing ceremony for the merger. This was the moment Mark would become a titan of the industry. It was also the moment he would be the most visible, the most vulnerable, and the most desperate to keep up appearances. He wanted optics. I was going to give him a show. I sat down at the dining table and took out a legal pad. One of his. I began to map out the web. I didn't just need to prove he was a cheater, I needed to prove he was a liability. I needed to show the Ishikawa family that Mark Vance wasn't just a man with a messy personal life, but a man who would eventually steal from them too. I spent the next 3 hours creating a digital dead man switch. I uploaded the photos of Project Alpha, the marriage certificate, and the embezzlement logs to a secure server. If anything happened to me, if Mark tried to use his fixers, those files would be sent directly to the New York Bar Association, the district attorney, and every major news outlet in the city. For the first time in 10 years, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I had spent a decade being the support beam for his life. I had learned his rhythm, his fears, and his blind spots. I knew that Mark's greatest weakness was his need to be admired. He didn't just want to be rich. He wanted to be the smartest person in every room. He treated me like a background character. Because he couldn't imagine a world where I was smarter than him, I went to the bedroom and pulled out a small, locked jewelry box. Inside was a key to a safe deposit box my father had left me. Mark didn't know about it. He thought I'd spent that small inheritance on furniture. In that box was enough cash to keep me invisible for months. I packed one small suitcase. Not the old, sensible clothes he liked. I packed the black dress I'd bought in secret a year ago, the one he'd called too aggressive for a lawyer's wife. I packed my documents, my father's watch, and the iPad. As I stood at the door, I took one last look at the life I was leaving behind. I wasn't sad. I was empty, and in that emptiness, there was a terrifying power. Mark had taken my reservation at the restaurant, but he had accidentally given me a seat at a much larger table. I walked out of the apartment and left my wedding ring on the kitchen counter, right in the center of the notice to vacate. The war hadn't started yet, but I had already won the first battle. I had stopped being afraid of him. The next 6 days were a masterclass in self-erasure. I didn't go to a hotel. I didn't go to a friend's. I went to a hacker hostel in Brooklyn, a place where 20-somethings in hoodies lived on caffeine and code. Nobody asked for my last name. Nobody cared that I looked like a suburban housewife who had just stepped out of a wreckage. They only cared that I paid in cash and kept my headphones on. I spent 18 hours a day at a corner desk, my eyes burning from the blue light of the iPad. I wasn't just watching Mark, I was learning. I used the credentials I'd pulled from his device to mirror his phone. Every text he sent to Elena, every status update from his partners, every panicked email about the Ishikawa merger. It all flowed through my screen first. The struggle was physical. My body missed the comfort of my high-thread count sheets. My stomach twisted at the smell of cheap takeout. But the mental struggle was worse. Every time I saw a message from him to Elena, "I'm so glad that's over. I finally feel free." A part of me wanted to scream. It's one thing to be betrayed, it's another to watch the person who destroyed you celebrate your absence like they've just shed a heavy skin. But I practiced a new kind of discipline, the discipline of the ghost. Every time I felt like lashing out, I'd force myself to read a chapter of the New York Penal Code regarding fiduciary duty. I wasn't Sarah the librarian anymore. I was becoming a forensic analyst of my own misery. I discovered that Elena wasn't just a consultant. She was a high-level corporate mole. She had played Mark perfectly. She had convinced him to move the stolen money into accounts that she actually controlled through a series of complex power of attorney documents he had signed in the heat of their romance. Mark thought he was the apex predator, but he was being bled dry by a woman who was even more ruthless than he was. I watched through the camera of his office computer as he sat at his desk, looking older, more haggard. He was drinking more. The stress of the merger was hitting him. Ishikawa was asking for deeper audits. The partners were starting to notice the irregularities I had subtly flagged by sending anonymous, encrypted tips to the firm's compliance officer. I grew in those 6 days. I learned that my passivity was actually a deep well of patience that Mark had never tapped. I learned how to move money through digital wallets. I learned how to create burner identities. Most importantly, I learned how to look at Mark Vance without feeling a single ounce of love. He was no longer the man I married. He was a case study in ego-driven collapse. I spent my last few $100s on a high-end makeup kit and a session with a stylist who specialized in corporate reinvention. I needed a mask. I needed to be able to walk into the Waldorf Astoria and look like I belonged to the world that had tried to eject me. By Monday night, the transformation was complete. I sat on my bunk in the hostel, looking at the black dress and the iPad. I had the Project Alpha files ready to go. I had the evidence of Elena's true identity, and I had the exact timing of the Ishikawa signing. I wasn't the woman who stood trembling at the obsidian anymore. That woman had died of thirst. The woman sitting here now was hydrated by pure, cold resolve. Tomorrow was the gala. Tomorrow, Mark would stand on a stage and wait for the crown to be placed on his head. I just had to make sure the crown was made of lead. The Waldorf Astoria's grand ballroom was a cathedral of arrogance. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen explosions, and the air was thick with the scent of $500 steaks and the quiet hum of men discussing how to divide the world. I stood at the back of the room, draped in that sharp black dress, a champagne glass in my hand that I hadn't touched. I watched him. Mark was on the podium, looking every bit the victor. He was adjusted his silk tie, leaning in to whisper a joke to Mr. Ishikawa, who sat like a stone statue in the front row. Elena was there too, sitting at the VIP table, wearing my grandmother's necklace. She looked radiant, but I saw the way her eyes kept darting to her phone. She was waiting for the final confirmation that the offshore transfers were complete. She was ready to bolt the moment the ink was dry. Mark stepped to the microphone. Tonight, he began, his voice booming with that practiced legal authority. It's about legacy. It's about building something that lasts. I want to thank my partners, and of course, my beautiful wife, for their unwavering support. The room applauded. He looked at Alina. I looked at my watch. 7:14 p.m. I reached into my clutch and pressed send on a pre-drafted email. Simultaneously, 40 tablets on the tables of the senior partners and the Ishikawa delegation chimed. I had used Mark's own administrative credentials to push a urgent merger addendum notification to every attendee's device. But it wasn't an addendum. I watched the wave of silence move through the room. It started at the front. David, the senior managing partner, opened his tablet. His face went from a polite smile to a ghostly white. He looked at the screen, then at Mark, then back at the screen. On every device in that room was a high-resolution image of the Project Alpha folder. Then came the marriage certificate dated 3 weeks ago. And finally, the scrolling ledger of the client escrow accounts. Mark had drained. And the power of attorney documents, showing that Alina had already moved those funds into her own private accounts, leaving Mark with nothing but the liability. The applause died. It didn't just stop, it curdled. Mark noticed the shift. He stumbled over his next sentence. As we look toward the future of Vance and Associates. He trailed off as he saw Mr. Ishikawa stand up. The CEO didn't look angry. He looked disgusted. He held up his tablet, showing the photo of Mark and Elena's Vegas marriage certificate. Mr. Vance. Ishikawa's voice was like ice. In my country, a man who cannot keep his own house in order is not fit to hold the keys to another's wealth. And a man who steals from his own clients is not a man at all. Mark's face drained of color. He looked toward Alina, his eyes begging for help, but Alina wasn't looking at him. She was staring at her phone in horror. I had sent her a private message seconds before. The accounts are frozen, the bar association is in the lobby. Run. She didn't even say goodbye. She stood up, knocked over her chair, and sprinted toward the side exit. Mark stood on that stage, alone under the spotlight, as his senior partners rose as one body. They didn't walk toward him to help. They walked toward the security team at the door. I stepped out from the shadows of the velvet curtains. I walked slowly down the center aisle, the clicking of my heels the only sound in the suffocating silence. Mark saw me. He gripped the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned purple. Sarah. He gasped into the live microphone. The name echoed through the hall. A pathetic, hollow sound. I didn't stop until I was at the foot of the stage. I looked up at him. The man who told me I didn't fit the room. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just raised my glass. Happy anniversary, Mark, I said, my voice calm and perfectly clear. I think you're in my seat. The doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. 4 men in dark suits, investigators from the district attorney's office, entered. The Hoptics. Mark had worked so hard for were finally perfect a billionaire, to be caught in the glare of 1,000 lenses, falling from a height he'd never be able to climb again. The ballroom didn't erupt into chaos. It wasn't a movie-style brawl. It was something much more devastating, a silent, systematic withdrawal. One by one, the titans of industry stood up, adjusted their jackets, and walked toward the exits. They didn't look at Mark, they looked past him, as if he had already become a ghost. In their world, failure is contagious, and Mark was now the most infected man in New York. I stayed exactly where I was, at the foot of the stage. Mark was still clutching the podium, his breathing shallow and ragged. He looked down at me, and for the first time in our entire marriage, he looked small. He didn't look like the brilliant litigator or the high society shark. He looked like a man who had bet everything on a lie and just realized the house always wins. The investigators reached the stage. One of them, a man with graying hair and a tired expression, stepped up to Mark. Mark Vance. We have a warrant for your arrest regarding grand larceny and third-degree embezzlement. Please step away from the microphone. Mark didn't move. He looked at the handcuffs, then back at me. Sarah. He whispered, his voice cracking. You don't understand. Elena, she set me up. I was doing this for us. For our future. The lie was so pathetic it didn't even hurt. It was like watching a child try to explain away a broken vase while holding the hammer. I didn't feel the surge of joy I thought I would. I didn't feel like cheering. Instead, I felt a profound sense of stillness. The future he was talking about was a dream he'd sold me to keep me quiet while he dismantled my life. The future is here, Mark, I said. And it looks exactly like what you built. As they led him off the stage, his heels dragging slightly on the polished wood, he passed by David, his senior partner. David didn't say a word, he just handed Mark's personal briefcase to one of the officers. The partnership was over, the career was over. The legacy was a crime scene. I turned away before they reached the lobby. I didn't want to see him in the back of a squad car. I didn't need that image to feel whole. I walked over to the VIP table where Alana had been sitting. My grandmother's necklace was lying there, tangled in a silk napkin. She had dropped it in her panic to flee. I picked it up. The gold was cool against my palm. This was the only thing I wanted back. Not the apartment, not the status. Not the money. Just the pieces of me that were mine before he ever entered the picture. I walked out of the Waldorf Astoria through the service entrance. I didn't want the cameras. I didn't want the reporters. I walked 2 blocks to a small, quiet diner, the kind of place where the coffee is burnt and the booths are cracked vinyl. I sat down and ordered grilled cheese. I sat there for an hour, the necklace gripped in my hand, watching the news break on the small TV above the counter. Breaking, legal giant Mark Vance arrested at gala. My face wasn't in the footage. My name wasn't in the crawl. I was the ghost who had walked through the walls of his empire and taken the foundation with me. I realized then that the best part of this wasn't seeing him fall. It was the fact that I could finally sit in a room, any room, and not wonder if I fit. I was the one who had survived. I was the one who was free. The waitress came by and refilled my cup. "You okay, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost." I looked at her and felt a genuine, tired smile touch my lips. "No," I said softly. "I think I just stopped being one." 3 months later, the dust hadn't just settled, it had buried the world I used to live in. The trial was the kind of spectacle Mark would have loved, if he weren't the one sitting at the defense table in a suit that was starting to hang loose on his frame. He had tried to blame everyone, his partners, the ROG, Elena, even me. But you can't argue with a digital trail of your own making. I sat in the back of the courtroom on the day of the sentencing. I wasn't there as a witness. I was there as a spectator of my own history. When the judge handed down the 10-year minimum, the room stayed quiet. There was no gasping. There was just the heavy, clinical sound of a gavel ending a life. Afterward, as they were leading him out through the side door, Mark stopped. He saw me. His lawyer tried to pull him away, but he resisted, staring at me with a look that was half hatred and half pleading. He expected me to say something. He expected me to gloat, to throw his words back in his face, to show him that I was the victor. I didn't. I just sat there, my hands folded in my lap, looking at him with the same neutral expression I'd used to look at a stranger on a bus. I didn't hate him anymore. Hate is an investment of energy, and I had closed that account. "Sarah," he mouthed through the glass. I gave him a single slow nod, not of forgiveness, just of acknowledgement. I was acknowledging that he finally understood what I had known for months. That I was the one who controlled the ending of this story. I didn't need to win a shouting match to be in charge. I left the courthouse and walked toward the new office I'd rented in a quiet, brick building in Brooklyn. I had started a consulting firm. I didn't use the Vance name, of course. I used my maiden name, the one he'd tried to replace. My clients weren't high-rolling legal giants. They were the people Mark used to call collateral damage. They were the ones who had been cheated out of their homes, their futures, and their dignity by men exactly like him. I'm good at what I do. I'm good because I know how the predators think. I know how they hide their tracks, and I know the exact moment they get overconfident. I don't move fast, and I don't make a scene. I just sit in the shadows and wait for them to trip over their own egos. I was sitting at my desk that afternoon when a courier arrived. It was a package from the liquidation of the Vance estate. Inside were the few things Mark had left. A few books, some personal papers, and a small, leather-bound journal. I opened the journal to the last page. In Mark's shaky handwriting, there was a single line. "I never realized you were watching." I didn't feel a surge of pride. I just felt the weight of the truth. He spent 10 years thinking I was a background character in his movie. He never realized that the person who cooks your meals, manages your home, and listens to your secrets is the most dangerous person in your life if you treat them like trash. I put the journal in the paper shredder. I didn't need it for my archives. I didn't need to remember his perspective. The phone rang. It was a new client, a woman whose husband had just told her he was moving on and leaving her with nothing. Her voice was trembling, the same way mine had at the restaurant. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "He says he's thought of everything. He says I don't have a chance." I leaned back in my chair and looked at the sun setting over the bridge. "Take a breath," I said, my voice steady and calm. "He thinks he's playing chess. But people like him forget that the board is only as strong as the wood it's built on." "Can you help me?" she asked. "No," I said, a faint smile on my lips. "I'm going to teach you how to help yourself. And then, we're going to watch him realize that he's already lost." I went back to the Obsidian one last time last week. Not for an anniversary. Not to prove a point to the ghosts of my past. I went there for a business lunch with the woman I'd been helping for the last 6 months. Her divorce had just been finalized. She didn't walk away with the severance her husband had tried to force on her. She walked away with the deed to their estate and the dignity he'd tried to strip from her bones. The hostess was different. New staff. New management. The scandal with Mark had forced the restaurant to undergo a rebranding. To distance itself from the toxic elite that used to call it home, it felt different. Smaller, less like a temple of ego and more like just a restaurant. I sat at the same table, the one by the window, the one Mark told me I didn't fit. I ordered the salmon. I drank a glass of plain water. I looked out at the street where I had walked in blisters and tears that night a year ago. My companion was talking about her new life, about the relief of finally being able to sleep through the night without checking her husband's phone or wondering which lie was the truth. "You seem so settled, Sarah," she said, pausing to look at me with genuine wonder. "Like nothing in the world could ever shake you again. How do you do it? After everything he did, how do you sit here so calmly?" I looked at the white tablecloth. I looked at the fork resting on the porcelain plate. I remembered the exact sound it made when Mark told me to leave. I remembered the way my heart had turned to ash in this very spot. "I learned that there are 2 kinds of people in this world," I said. "There are those who think the table belongs to them because they have the loudest voice and the thickest wallet. And there are those who know that the table is just wood and cloth." She frowned, tilted her head. "And which one are you?" I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It wasn't a sad one. It was the smile of someone who had seen the bottom of the ocean and decided to build a city there. "I'm the one who realized I don't need the table to be fed," I said. "And I'm the one who realized that once you stop being afraid to lose everything, you become the only person in the room who truly has anything." I finished my lunch. I paid the bill. The whole bill. I left a generous tip for the waiter. A kid who looked like he was just starting out. As I walked out, I didn't look back. I didn't need to check the mirrors to see if anyone was watching. I didn't need to see if I fit the room anymore. The room was just a room. The city was just a city. And Mark was just a name on a legal brief, a man sitting in a gray cell, finally learning the true cost of the reservation he took from me. He thought he was the architect of my destruction. He never realized he was just the demolition crew I needed to build something permanent. I walked out into the afternoon air. It was warm. It was bright. I headed toward the subway, blending into the thousands of other people, each with their own stories, their own pains, their own secrets. You might be sitting there right now, listening to this, feeling exactly like I did, feeling like the person you trusted most has taken your seat, feeling like you've been told to leave a life you helped build because you're no longer useful to their brand. If you are, I have one thing to tell you: don't scream, don't beg, don't even try to fix what they broke. Just listen, just watch, and start building the version of yourself that doesn't need their permission to exist. Because the most dangerous person in the world isn't the one with the power, the money, or the connections. It's the one who was left for dead and decided they liked the silence better. Mark thought he took my night. He thought he took my seat. He never realized that by making me leave the table, he finally gave me the chance to stand up. I hope you're enjoying your dinner, Mark. I hope it was worth the price, because I'm finally full.